Shemai everyone, welcome back to the Athlete Climate Academy. My name is Hugh James. I'm here today with the wonderful Natalie Berry, who's a journalist and a climber and editor-in-chief for UKC, UK Climbing. Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Hugh, for having me. It's great to be here today.
Now, we've seen each other in a few different places around the UK on different scenes at things like COP26, but also Kendal Mountain Festival and the likes. You straddle now this really strange world between outdoor and adventure, but also the climate community as well. You seem to write about both. So tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into writing, but also in the climbing scene.
So at school, I always loved languages. I was quite good at English and always liked writing about all different things. And then I discovered climbing when I was about 9 and didn't have an outdoorsy family, got into it completely by chance at an outdoor centre. They had it was like a shopping centre, and they had one of those mobile climbing towers, and I had to go and really liked it. And then the next day went to the kids club and then started getting into competitions. I didn't really know anything about outdoor climbing, and I was quite content to just train indoors and do competitions, get on the British team. I was really fortunate to be able to travel the world as part of the British team and compete. Went to a lot of nice places like Australia, China. Had a lot of great experiences, made a lot of friends. And then I guess these two passions kind of merged when I went to university. I was climbing outdoors a lot more. I was studying languages. I started to write a bit about climbing trips, just blogs and things about sport climbing trips to France and Spain. Then when I finished university, my degree was in French and German. A job came up at ukclimbing.com for an assistant editor, and it looked really good. It was working remotely, writing. Obviously, my climbing knowledge came in a lot of use as well. So I decided to go for it, got the job. And since then, I've been writing articles about climbing, news reports, but also trying to broaden the topics. I don't want to just write about people climbing bits of rock. I want to write about different topics and about the climbing community and just try and explore the world through climbing, I guess.
Well, I feel like that's one of I love how you just nonchalantly dropped in the British climbing team into that as well. But yeah, that's fine. Just part of the British climbing team. But I love that about, especially about climbing, that I feel a lot of the stories that come from climbing, some of them are about the actual routes themselves, but a lot of it is the place, the location, the people, the stories around the actual climb. So I suppose that lends itself to the writing and the journalism part.
Yeah, I think I've always been more interested in this. Like I started off, I was quite interested in profiles of people, like what motivated people to climb, what was their background, and then I kind of broadened out into issues that were affecting wider society and how the climbing community could help maybe solve the problems, but talk about the problems like LGBTQ plus issues, mental health issues, environmental issues. And currently we're talking quite a bit about, the war in Ukraine and just all these different things that you might not expect normally on a climbing or a niche sports website. But it's just something, it interests me. And I think while we do get some criticism of, keep politics out of climbing, or, don't come here to read about what's going on in the rest of the world, come here to escape the problems of the world. I think overwhelmingly, I think a lot of people appreciate that and don't just want to read about the top climbers taking new routes and hearing about where they've been. I think it's just having some diversity on the website is just makes it more interesting, and it's not just all about I climbed this or I climbed that.
Well, I think we're realizing now that, in this age where we can be whatever we want to be, that identities aren't singular and they're not stacked side by side, they're leveled on top of each other. So, you might be a climber, but also you might be a farmer, and you might be a writer, and you might be a father or a mother, and you might be all these other things where your identities kind of slowly stack up. Whereas, if you come to somebody like the UK Climbing website, you might want to just read about climbing, but everyone on there has all these different identities that they can bring to the table. And I feel now we're in a place where we are allowed to bring all these identities to the table.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more freedom, and I think we're very lucky to live in the society we do here in the UK especially. And just, I think one of the things that really annoyed me when I was growing up and getting into climbing, I'd see athletes posting opinions about different topics, and you'd see how they'd attract criticism from people saying, like, just stick to sport, like you don't have to speak out about anything, like why are you talking about politics? Again, the whole like keep politics and climbing separate. And I think, while I'm not a professional athlete, I'm a sponsored athlete and I'm a journalist, and I do try to read about things and try and educate myself and share opinions or share article of other people's opinions about things, and try not to shy away from that. It is difficult because I think in the internet and the online sphere at the moment and over the years, there's a lot of stick to be given. People get a lot of criticism for putting their neck on the line and voicing an opinion. So I think it's hard, especially as a woman, I think, or a minority person, to stand up and say, this is what I think, or this is what I think is important, this is what I believe in. But if we don't do that, then there's just no discussion at all, or opinions just get shut down. So that's something that I think I've grown better at, and probably through my job, like I get a lot of criticism online and in the UKC forums. Your work's constantly out there. People are judging you for how you write and what you write. So I think I've grown up in this small world, and it's maybe a bit of an echo chamber sometimes, but on UKC, like I was posting as a kid on UKC and just reading people's opinions. So I think I kind of grew a slightly thicker skin through that, but I can see why the climate today is quite scary to write anything online, but any thoughts online.
But I feel like one of the reasons your work stands out, and we'll put a link to your portfolio in the description, is in this we talk a lot about factivism in the world of athletes and how to get your stuff out there and your thoughts out there and dealing with facts only and that kind of thing. I feel like your work is so thorough and so well researched that it's hard for people to have. They'll always find complaints with it. I'm sure that you see all those on the forums, but it's hard to disagree with facts, right? When you're like, this is what happened at COP26, the Conference of Parties, this is what happened, or this is what happened now with climate change. When they're just facts in there, it's really hard to disagree with them. So I wonder if, because your stuff's so well researched, why it stands up so well. But did you find it hard to get into? Do you find it hard to start writing about climate and getting that kind of stuff out there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll be the first to admit I don't really know what I'm doing half the time. Like, I don't have any professional journalism training or degree, so I've kind of been self-taught. Like, I read things about verifying your sources and fact checking, and not writing fake news or just copying people's work or whatever, doing your own individual reporting. But so I know the basics, and I try to just stick by them. And I think, the issue with climate science is, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't have a science degree. I mean, I was interested in science at school. Like, I was kind of torn between medicine and languages, but, I don't feel qualified to write the things I do sometimes. But I just try to report the facts. Like, if I write about the IPCC report or something about COP26, I just try to be, it's hard to be objective when the facts are there and it's saying we've got a climate emergency. But just, I think the information is getting easier to digest. It's not, you don't have to wade through scientific papers anymore. There's lots of really clear journalism and really powerful stories, I think, online, which make it more accessible. And then I just try to, with the climbing and COP26 and what the things that I've done in recent years, I just try to make it a bit more exciting, like report the kind of reports that you have to wade through are very dry, very fact filled, and just trying to make them more digestible. And also add personal stories. Like I lived in Chamonix for a few years, and it was really there where I started to become more aware of the impacts of climate change on mountain areas. So I'm trying to bring my own personal experience and the things that I've seen and witnessed myself into, creative writing or essays or, the reporting that I do, because I've made contacts from living in these areas, and people there are much more knowledgeable than me. So they're the ones I kind of check things with or get opinions on from. And I think that just helps to make it more valid. And, I'm sure I do make mistakes, and people call me out for that rightly. But I just try to be as accurate as possible, not too hyperbolic or, too negative, because I don't think that's helpful either in climate reporting.
Well, what you've been saying there with I'm not an expert, listen to people with more experience or more valid experiences or whatever. First off, you are a wonderful writer, and I enjoy every single piece that you put out. But I think that's part of it, right? Like saying that you can't be an expert on absolutely everything. It is absolutely impossible to be. There are some people out there experts on lots, but the idea of, from a journalism point of view, of just listening to people with those valid experiences and who have done it and having trusted sources, that's something I teach a lot about, thinking like a scientist, but I think there could be a whole thing on thinking like a journalist. Mm-hmm. Like, how do we go out there and find valid resources that are trustworthy? How to pick people that you can go back to time and time again, who are going to put out trustful information. If our athletes are trying to find those sources of truthful information, what's the best way to go about it? Is it to go... I assume it's just to Google things, and then the first thing that pops up, that's the one you can trust, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, it's quite a tough question. I think, Google things at first. That's what I do, tend to do some Googling. But I think there's a lot of, like, specifically mountain-related partnerships and organizations. So if you're a climber, maybe that's a good place to start, because, they'll have information on the areas that you visit, like the Alps or the Himalayas. So things like CREA Mont Blanc and the UN Mountain Partnership. There's so many where, like, every few weeks I keep seeing, like, discovering new organizations, that deal with mountain climate science. For climate science in general, I'd also, Protect Our Winters as well. They've got a lot of really useful resources for athletes, not just related to skiing and snowboarding, but they've got a lot of resources online, and a lot of things that you can do to, write to politicians and things. I think, just the easiest place to get valid information is probably just IPCC reports, stuff from COP26. You can't really fault those documents. Like, they might take a bit of time to wade through, but there's a lot of reporting from websites from newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times, The Guardian. Just check if you're going to use newspapers, and try and check. Of course, some newspapers have bias on these issues, or climate deniers and stuff. So just be careful of the sources that you're looking up to try and find information. But I think there's a lot of misinformation, but also, I think more and more there's good information out there, and it should hopefully rise to the top of Google rather than fake news and wrong facts.
Well, the thing is, though, we ran a session with a bunch of athletes quite recently on how to find that kind of information. Carbon Brief, I need to say, is one of the better ones out there, and like you say about newspapers, we know which ones are the respectable newspapers, and we know which ones are not respectable. So going to the respectable ones is always good. But when just Googling things, I got them to Google in a bunch of different ways. So you can do this whilst you listen to this podcast as well. That Google things like humans caused climate change, and what pops up is a bunch of articles and journalism about how humans have caused climate change. But then if you Google humans did not cause climate change, then what normally pops up is a bunch of articles on the fact that the humans didn't cause climate change at all. And the idea of positive bias in what you're looking for, you really do have to think like a journalist in how do I phrase this in an unbiased way? How do I find, like, climbing communities are great because there is no bias to one side or the other. We've got no skin in the game when it comes to whether we use fossil fuels or not. So, UKC and a bunch of other places are great to protect our winters. The Honnold Foundation are doing some really good stuff at the moment as well. And when it comes to getting our information, going to those non-biased sources or trying to find out who's non-biased is actually quite difficult. And one of my main go-to places is still Twitter. Like I find people on there, scientists, normally scientists who've had a hand in the IPCC report. And I follow them, and what they have to say, I know I can trust it, and I found my trusted sources, and I'll stick with them. Finding those really trustworthy people, and I'd recommend everyone follow Natalie and consider her one of those trustworthy people. It's a really good way of getting that information quick, because you can't always go and dive through those reports for every single thing that you want to check, right? So you need to have those people that you can trust. So the climbing community itself it can do some really big things. The one of the biggest in the UK was Climbers Against Cancer, which I think is still one of the best initiatives that I've ever been a part of. But when it comes to climate, what can the climbing community actually do when it comes to reporting on climate change and making a difference?
Well, I think as climbers, one of our, guilty or dirty habits is traveling a lot. Like, we take flights to far-flung places. I think a lot of people in the pandemic, learned to kind of stick to their own stomping ground, like keep local. I think that was quite a valuable lesson. That said, I do think, maybe we'll talk about this in a bit with how much of it is individual responsibility versus societal, how much of it is a structural problem, what could be done at a much higher level. But I do think there is, everyone can play a part in trying to minimize the impact of climate change. So I think for climbers, just trying to think more consciously about methods of travel, like, can you get the train to places rather than fly? And I know that's an issue at the moment because train prices are through the roof. And again, that's a structural thing that we don't have that much control over. And if you're trying to save money, it's cheaper to get a 50 quid flight with a discount flight brand. But yeah, I think a lot of climbers in lockdown have actually found a lot of joy and interest in staying a bit more local and doing things like car sharing, and just, you might want to spend lots of money and go to a really interesting new place, but I think having all that taken away from us has made us appreciate our own environment more and maybe become more environmentally conscious, and just thinking a bit more about our impact on the places we visit and how we can minimize a carbon footprint. Other than that, I think, just speaking out a bit more, and like we've got, as you were saying about the climbing community and Climbers Against Cancer, just sharing information or asking questions and talking about the issues with friends. I think we've talked in the past a bit about imperfect activism and am I a hypocrite because I'm here talking about how bad climate change is, but next week I'm taking a flight to America, which I actually am. So But it's this idea that if you are not 100% perfect and you don't have any carbon footprint at all, like unless that's you, then you can't be seen to be speaking out. And I don't think that's helpful, because then that just shuts down all conversation and we can't get anywhere and nobody's putting pressure on anyone. So yeah, I think just harnessing that climbing community and being a bit more vocal would also really help.
Two things there I picked up on, which I think were fantastic points. The environmentally conscious one of simply, even if you do take a flight, and I'd argue that, if you go into Nepal to climb, there is no greener option than flying, out to the, like, you can't really feasibly take a ship or drive across, or you could, but not feasibly. So, but being conscious of that decision, and saying, okay, this is the most reasonable, cost-effective, and maybe not the most environmentally friendly way, but it's the most feasible for me. Just being conscious of that decision. Instead, I think we went through a time of just flying places and doing things and not really thinking about it. But I think people are a lot more conscious now of it. And even if we still do it, I honestly think that that's fine, as long as we are conscious about it and think about ways of, if we can minimize that impact, then we do. But also then, being outspoken is the one thing that, climbers, especially sponsored climbers and professional athletes, are going to have a big platform when it comes to social media. And it's not simple. It's not easy to go out and be vocal about it. But one thing I've been pushing other athletes to do is have a conversation at your local climbing gym about it. It doesn't need to be on social media to thousands or tens of thousands of people. Some of the most interesting and worthwhile conversations I think I've had about COVID during the COVID crisis is with friends on Facebook, just instant messaging back and forth. And, towards, I'll put in air quotes, the end, because it's not really over, they've said to me, thank you so much for just being a sounding board and a trustworthy source of information and that kind of stuff. That might have been like 6 people. So I'm not, but it's really worthwhile, because I think that's made a big difference. And if we can't put stuff on social media because of the trolls and everything else, having conversations at the climbing gym, I think is a worthwhile thing to do.
At COP26, I went to a really interesting talk at the New York Times Climate Hub, and it was sponsored by Nike, and they had one of the athletes on, and she was talking about how, she felt a bit like me. She felt, I don't really know what I'm talking about. Like, I don't know the science. I'm not an expert. So how do I talk about this thing? And she's a footballer, so she's got loads of followers, like more than probably any climber. And she just felt really intimidated and didn't feel like she could speak out about it. And she was talking about how there was this organization that was trying to help athletes speak out a bit more about, a bit like what you're doing about climate change and what we can all do. And she was also saying how a lot of the time when athletes speak out, they do it on issues like they do it in retirement. They're too scared, or they feel like they can't speak out like at the peak of their career when they've got the biggest following and the biggest number of eyes on them, so that they feel too scared to voice their opinions then. But then they'll become, once they've the focus has shifted from sport to other things, they'll have more time to think, and they'll maybe start to broaden out the scope onto climate issues, political stuff. But I think it'd be really nice to see more current athletes try and balance elites. I know it's really hard, elite sport and activism as well. To be able to do both at once would be really powerful, rather than waiting until retirement when maybe you don't have sponsors to annoy if you're too outspoken or whatever. But I think I would also like to think that sponsors and companies are getting a bit more tolerant of. I think they're waking up to the fact you can't just be a one-trick pony athlete anymore. If you've got more sides to you and you care about these causes, which more companies are waking up to, then I think that's an asset. Really, it's not something to be ashamed of, and we should have the confidence to speak up.
Absolutely, and we say this time and time again on the podcast and in our training that those simple conversations could then lead, back up the chain within, if you're a sponsored climber, then having that conversation with your, with the athlete manager at your sponsor, or with the CSR manager there, as they start that starts to trickle back up, and they see our athletes are actually really invested in this, as well as the people who buy our products as well. Then that's going to start trickling up. And I was at a summit with one of the world's biggest outdoor manufacturers recently, and seeing what they're doing without the outside world looking in, it was just an internal thing, and seeing them talk about the choices that they want to make and having the athletes make those choices with them. It was a good example of how an individual can make systemic change, can change the system by speaking back up the chain of command to the top,
Yeah, I think it started to happen. Like, there are more and more climbers speaking out, and I think it used to be if you had a particular outdoor brand that was quite environmentally, conscious, and that would make it a bit easier to speak out. And at first I noticed that it was like solely those athletes who were speaking out, but now, like, Sébastien Bert, he's like a Belgian climber, he just climbed El Capitan. He put up this big poster which said, war should be against climate change. So, it was a huge banner, and he lugged this thing up with him and his friend, and they attach it to the wall, and you could see it from the valley, and he took photos.
Wow.
So that kind of thing was quite impactful. And talking about speaking out and writing about things, there's been demonstrations like that on cliffs for many different political issues. And just before COP26, actually, in Glasgow, a group of people did the same thing at Dumbarton Rock in Glasgow. They put a banner up. I can't remember what it said exactly, but yeah, just protesting and trying to get the voice heard in a different way. Putting a banner up on a rock face, and I think it made one of the newspapers. And yeah, it's just, there's different things you can do, activism, and it's good to see more people just getting involved in that way. Like, the Sebastian story is really interesting because he sailed from Europe to Yosemite, or Europe to Mexico, and then they drove up to Yosemite. So that was quite a sustainable. Yeah. I mean, it took them months, and I don't know what condition they were in when they got to the United States. But it shows that if you have the time, and I appreciate that kind of thing isn't an option for everyone to sail to America, but it's just quite a cool thing that he was doing. Just a novel. It's an adventure, if nothing else, and he had a message to put across.
Well, it comes back to the journalism point of it. It tells a good story, right? Like, it's one of those things that was it not at all feasible for everyone. A fight would have been better. How much carbon did he actually save? All that, but at the end of the day, it's still a very good story that got a great message out. And if there's one thing for athletes to take away from this session, and as being a journalist, is that a story kind of rules everything, right? So if you've got a good story, whether it's around the people that you see along the way, or the impacts that you see from climate change, that writing about it, getting it out there on social media is difficult, but a worthwhile thing to do, I reckon, and I'm sure you think
yeah,
too.
Definitely. I think there's different ways to do it. I mean, I appreciate not everyone wants to write a story. I think increasingly video is taking over the written word, and if you look at things like TikTok and how popular it is with the younger generation, like just doing, like, they're so creative at doing like funny videos, or it doesn't have to be serious or all doom and gloom, but I'm sure people could think of much more creative ways to get a message across than I could in an article kind of thing. And using social media, say Twitter, as you said, is really good for informing yourself if you use it properly. But things like Instagram, I don't know, if you can't put it into words, or you don't think people would read the captions, like, can you do something visual? I think just using creativity as well in messaging is really important. Like, if you don't have a personal story, like, can you speak, as you were saying, can you speak to someone who has firsthand experience of glacial melt in the Alps, or who's been to the Himalayas and maybe noticed changes, like, yeah, just reach out to people and try and share other people's stories. Like, if you don't have a story yourself, or if you're put off by the figures and the percentages and statistics, like, there's just other ways you can talk about it. Like, one of the most powerful stories at COP26 was by Vanessa Nakate, a Ugandan youth activist. And she was talking about how climate change disproportionately impacted women compared to men. And she was saying that when fields got flooded, women couldn't climb trees because in their culture, like, women were not allowed to climb trees, not supposed to climb trees. So they weren't very active. They didn't have the skill set necessary to climb trees and escape from the flood. So a lot of women and girls died. And that's something that I wouldn't have thought about, but it's very, striking, like, horrific story. But that's stayed with me. That was one of the most memorable stories of COP26, and it just illustrates, we don't think it's a crisis in the UK or in the Western world, but a lot of countries it's already, people are dying and it's affecting some people more than others. And it was just, an illustration of all those things. And, I couldn't have told a story like that, but, if you can amplify Vanessa's story and buy her book, which is really good, the bigger picture, that's more powerful than what I can do with reciting a couple of figures from the IPCC report.
But as you say, like, as part of our jobs is to amplify other people's voices as well. And, whether that's through film or through photography or through writing, all viable ways of getting those messages out there and those stories out there that'll have a huge impact. Natalie, I could talk to you all day. Thanks so much for coming on. Natalie is a climber and a journalist and editor-in-chief at UK Climbing. Natalie, thanks for coming on Athlete Climate Academy, and we'll see you next time.